So the next example deals a little bit more with interoperability with Maya. So let's say we have a subset of what we had before. We have a model of a head here. And you can see this is kind of medium resolution. It's not really that high, but it's too high really to be able to make very basic topology changes. So what I'd like to be able to do is kind of take this down a bit. So right now we're dealing with about 235 to 235,000 polygons or so. And I'd like to be able to kind of reduce this down to the lowest possible set of quads. So let's go ahead and select under selecting. We'll select the object here, and we're going to go ahead and under mesh, we'll rebuild the subdivision mesh. And you can see that it found 3 lower subdivision levels. And so now I can go ahead and page down this very quickly to the very lowest level, which is about 3,700 polys. And you can see that we deal with a much lower resolution model that we can now much easier edit in Maya. Now what's nice is that I can take this into Maya, I can add topology, I can remove topology, I can change the UVs as well. One of the byproducts, one of the nasty byproducts of eliminating that much geometry, more than 90% of the geometry was eliminated, is that you will also affect the way the UVs were laid out, and therefore the way the texture shows up on the surface. And so we want to be able to fix that in Maya. Not only that, I also want to be able to take advantage of cutting up UV shells in Maya so that I can use them as a selection method inside of Mudbox. So there are a number of things that I'd like to be able to do inside of Maya. So let's go ahead and select this model, and the first thing to look at is this one-click interop set of functions features inside of Mudbox. These will also show up in Maya, so there's a send as new scene and update current scene. If you make changes to the model here in Mudbox, then those updates are sent across into Maya and they update the currently open model. You can update just the textures if you have any texture updates that need to be sent across, or you can add a piece of geometry that was created in Mudbox to the scene inside of Maya. There are also a number of preferences that you can set in here. If you don't want to send paint layers, and let's say you're just dealing with sculpting or modeling, you can just send the model. You can send each of the paint layers as individual layer textures, and so what it'll create is a series of textures that are all inputs to a layer texture node that is then an input to a channel like diffuse or specularity or so on. Or you could flatten all these paint layers. So if you wanted to use the paint layers as a reference to build against or to build something off of, you could do that just by flattening all the paint layers into a single texture, making it a lot easier to manage. Alright, and then down here you get some options for flattening sculpt layers, or if you wanted to go ahead and send the sculpt layers across as Maya blend shapes, which will allow you to jump into the blend shape editor and access each of those edits as blend shapes. Let's go ahead and OK this the way it is, and we're going to go to File, Send to Maya. I already have Maya open in the background, so let's go ahead and say Send as selected as new scene. And as soon as it comes in, you can see that we have it up here. We can put it in shaded mode. We can go ahead and turn on wireframe on shaded. We can turn on the texture. You can see the texture comes in, and the texture was partially screwed up because of the sheer decimation of number of polys that we worked or that we set up in Mudbox. So a couple things I want to be able to do, and the first of which is maybe cutting up some of these UV shells or creating more UV shells for selection purposes. So we go in here and create or bring up the UV texture editor, and let's go ahead and load this. Let's go ahead and frame this real quick. You can see that a couple of things are messed up. Now this is kind of done on purpose. The UVs are all mangled here, and I want to fix that, and that's one. I also want to add and remove some topology on this character, and then I want to cut up these UVs a little bit more so that we get a way to select specific parts of this model. So the first thing I'm going to do is fix the UVs so that I can set up proper UV cutting or UV shells. Let's go ahead and import a model, the model titled Minotaur Head, and bring that into the scene. There it is. And if I take a look at this, you can see that this is a much higher resolution model, has much more detail on it. If I turn off the wire there for a second, you can see what it looks like. And I can also go ahead and assign the shader to that model so that you'll see, let's go ahead and move this down a bit. Let's go ahead and do that and turn off the wire there so you can see that we get proper distribution of our textures across these this surface right here. So let's go ahead and select this and look at this in the UV texture area. You can see the UV shells are very clean and they're already set up. And I actually want to transfer all that information onto that low resolution model. So let's go ahead and zero that out and put the two models on top of each other. Select the high res first, low res second. We'll go to polys, we'll go to mesh, and we'll transfer what's called transfer attributes. We'll transfer the attributes. In this case, let's go ahead and reset this and turn everything off up here. I just like to start clean, and then maybe transfer vertex positions. And the reason why I might want to do that is transfer the vertices from the low res onto the high res so that the low resolution mesh occupies the exact same object space as that high res mesh. Second thing, maybe transfer the normals so we get normals to look correct. And the third, and the one that I was talking about here, is UV sets. We're going to go ahead and transfer UV sets from the high res to the low res, and then we'll transfer this, and as soon as that gets transferred, you can see that the model actually popped over, or vacuum form shrink wrapped onto the high res mesh and occupies the proper object space. So let's go ahead and delete the history on these two. I'm going to select the high res and get rid of it, and you can see that now my textures look a lot better in the transition between the horns and the head and all the other areas that needed fixing. And so now if I grab this and look at this in the UV texture editor, you can see that you get fewer UVs but properly laid out. So one of the things that I wanted to bring up here real quick, let's go ahead and edit the size of this window, is the cutting of UVs. And so if I wanted to go in and say, let's pick an edge along which we want to do that. So maybe I want to pick one in here, for example, right here. And we'll do the same thing on the other side. We're going to go ahead and click that. You can see that it shows up in here. We can then cut these very quickly and then maybe select the shell so I can see these shells that are that become pickable, and I can move them elsewhere in space. If I'm using them solely for selection purposes, and let's just imagine for a second I don't have a texture yet, I don't really care what these UVs look like. They could just all look like squares. I'm just going to go ahead and grab the proper sets of UVs, cut them where necessary so that I now get access to a selection that's going to help me manage what I can select in Mudbox. So that's one thing I have set up, and I'm going to show you what that looks like. And the reason why is because in Mudbox we have a new tool that allows you to select UV shells, and then it allows you to kind of mask what you're sculpting based on that selection. The next thing I want to do is add and remove some topology from and to our character. So if I go in here, maybe select an edge, and let's say we wanted to go ahead and build a collar that has a lot more detail in that neck area, I can go in here and insert edge loops, and let's go ahead and just add a single one and another one and another one, and then maybe right around the center we add another couple loops like that. Maybe around this horn I want to add some geometry over there and over there, and you can go crazy with that. I'm going to make a point by adding a little more because I want it to show up on the Mudbox side, and I'll show you what I mean in a second, because on the Mudbox side we have all of our levels still in place. So let's go in here and grab a loop, and I'm going to edge loop and delete. Let's go ahead and do the same thing over here. We're going to repeat that. I'm going to pick a simple edge, just click on the edge and hit the G key, maybe over here as well, over here as well. And I'm not going to do this on the other side. In other words, what we're going to have is a low res horn and a high res horn. And so that's kind of all I want to do. And at this point it's time to transfer this stuff all back to Mudbox. So from the Maya menus, we have a send to soft image, we have a send to Mudbox, and you can see that we get a send as new scene, an update current scene, add to current scene if I have new geometries that need to be added, or send a previously selected object. Now before we do that, under the Settings Preferences Plugin Manager, the plugins that would have to be loaded for this to work properly is the FBX-Maya.mll and the OneClick.mll. And so those two have to be loaded. Those menus will show up and they are actually accessible. So let's go ahead and send this to Mudbox, and we're going to update the current scene in this case. On the Mudbox side, it's going to ask us to import all that stuff that we just did. And the reason why it takes a little bit of time to do that is because all this stuff is brought into Maya, the eliminated geometry, the modified UV shells, the relaid out UVs, and the added loops. And so if I look at this closely, you can see that it did that at the base mesh, but then it rebuilt all the higher level meshes in Mudbox as well. And it did that automatically, which is a really nice thing to be able to do. So you can see that we get a really dense pileup of geometry around both of those horns, which we didn't have before. We get a pileup of geometry around the neck, which we didn't have before. This allows me to now go in at this level, at this particular level, and really start adding some details. If you look at the topology on the left horn versus the right horn, it's a little more spread out on the right horn. It's a little more even. It's a little more compressed on the left horn. And maybe I should have deleted even more geometry to make an even bigger point. So the other part of that story here is that under selection tools, we now have UV shell selection. So I can select UV shells, and in this case what I'm doing is I'm selecting in a mirrored fashion, so I can select just one shell on one side. If I mirror my selection, it selects both UV shells. And so in this case, these are the selections that I set up. So if I wanted to go ahead and use this as a mask, if you will, to sculpt off, I'm going to go ahead and create a new sculpt layer. There we go. And hit Shift M. And then hit Shift I, so we can go ahead and invert that mask. And then maybe use a sculpt brush. I'm going to go ahead and reset that brush. So we're using default values. And then increase the size of that brush a bit, something like this, and reduce the intensity so we get something a little more subtle. So let's go ahead and just kind of paint on the surface here. You can see that I'm expanding this. Or you can just go in here and hit the flood button, right? And it does that in all directions, everywhere on that surface. And maybe not that intense. I'm going to go in here and set the strength to 0.2, for example, and then maybe hit a flood. Oops, I hit reset instead of. So that is fine. Let's set this back to a strength and hit flood. And you can see that I get a slight increase there. Let's go ahead and do that. And now we get a little bit of a ridge. Maybe these are gold tips or something that are applied to these horns. If you wanted to, you can now create a paint layer for that. So that's kind of a way to manage what's happening with UVs, as well as how you're rebuilding topology between Mudbox and Maya, and how you can take advantage of the Maya toolset to modify models inside of Mudbox. Alright, so what I wanted to do next is maybe add another level. So we're going to go ahead and Shift D this so I can continue working with this in Mudbox the way I always have. And so now we have a little over 1 million polys. And I'm going to go to sculpting and create a new layer there and talk a little bit about some of the other brushes that we have in Mudbox. Let's open up this a little bit more and start with some of the vector displacement brushes. So down here we introduced those new icons in the last couple of releases, and they give you a little bit better sense of what this does. So if I go to stencils, for example, a vector displacement map that looks like this tells me that's going to look like an ear, or this tells me that it's going to look like, you know, scales. And that's a lot better than what we had before, which was this RGB offset image that didn't really show you what it was going to look like. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and grab a brush. I'm going to go ahead and crank up the strength. There you go. You can see it's working. I'm going to select that second brush. And in this case, if I wanted to, I can go ahead and create a slightly bigger brush and just kind of start to paint details onto the surface by also cranking up the build-up. Okay, that's a little too much, so let's reduce the strength to about 50%. Okay, and then let's go ahead and reduce the size of the brush. Now we're starting to get somewhere. All right, maybe not paint or press so hard. Maybe reduce this a little bit more. Okay, so if I wanted to paint scoots or scales on the back of the head of this character, and you can go ahead and mirror this because the nice thing about stenciling, no matter what kind of stencil you use, is that it mirrors properly. So if I have something like this and I paint a scoot or a scale, I'm going to go ahead and make this second one kind of fit like that. You can see that it's kind of peeking over the horizon there. The other side is doing the exact same thing. So it's a quick way to kind of create very complex geometry without having to custom build anything for it. These are part of the software, and these are very useful. Now, it does depend on which direction you paint in, clockwise or counterclockwise, because the orientation of the brush is related to the paint direction of your brush. If I paint in this direction versus this direction, you get opposite results. So let's go ahead, and you can see that this is all being pulled out. And if I do this in the opposite direction, which could be just as usual, you can see it's pushing it all in. And so let's go ahead and add that, and we get the same result on the other side. And so in this case, what I could do is I could just kind of dial this down in intensity or crank this back up depending on what I need. Now, the other one that we have here is kind of like a tubular look. So if I go in here and grab this new brush, you can see that I can paint very quickly these tubular details, artifacts, or these veins. And I might want to upres that even more onto the surface. If I make this really subtle, you can see that very quickly it allows me to add details like this to the model. And then the last one here is another example. I'll use this as a last example. We can go ahead and increase the size of the brush a bit, which is a quick way to kind of paint creasing or cuts into the surface. And so if I wanted to emphasize some of those cuts, I can go here and kind of emphasize kind of the folds on the fat of that character head. You can see that very quickly it kind of builds the natural breaks or cuts into the geometry. And then I can go in here and just maybe kind of add it in here as well. If I want to, I can smooth that out a bit using the Shift key. You get the idea. And so that's a quick way to get to these vector displacement brushes, which are essentially geometry brushes. That's what they're generated from a geometric detail that was built and then extracted as a vector displacement map. Okay, so the last thing that I'll cover here is this new imprint from center. And so for the imprint brush, if I go in here and use a stamp that looks like this, we have an option that says draw from center, which is a lot more useful than what we used to have. And so the imprint brush, if I place my cursor right there on that hump, for example, I can click and drag and then rotate, and the dragging happens from the center of where I started. So let's go ahead and drop down the intensity a bit, making it a lot more subtle, and then I can rotate it to kind of orient the shape and character of that stamp onto the surface. So that's a lot more interesting, a lot easier way to modify this. Actually, that was not the last thing. The last thing will be the grab brush. So if I go back into my sculpting tool set and I select a grab brush, we also have some options in here that are relatively new. Called grab silhouette. If I turn this off and I just grab something on, let's say we'll grab something on the neckline there, you can see that as I grab it and pull it, something like that, it's mirroring it on the other side. But the profile of what it grabbed was essentially a circle, even though I was grabbing it from a direction that was very dramatic, kind of like picking something on the Terminator here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to grab the silhouette, and when you grab the silhouette, you really do pick the all of the geometry that it sees in screen space, and so it allows you to modify the way you're grabbing very quickly. The other thing that can be very useful is this grabbing of geometry and then have it follow the direction of a path. And so if I turn that off, the grabbing and the pulling is very linear. If I grab this with follow path turned on, you can see that it very quickly allows you to create very complex shapes. And so maybe I want to go ahead and add some detail that looks like that. Let's go ahead and turn that off. I'm going to grab a smaller portion of this and maybe do something like that. So it's essentially the paint direction of your stroke that it tries to follow. And so that's a very useful way of creating very complex shapes. So the last portion that I'll cover in this presentation is related to how some of the stuff that you build in Mudbox can come across into Maya. So what we have here is a model that was built by Jesse Sandifer, and really quite nice, but we're just showing it at the very base resolution right now. And so I'm not going to turn on the very highest resolutions for everything, but maybe just for one of the pieces, so you can see what the fidelity and the details look like on the model. So let's go ahead and select the shell that surrounds him and start increasing the resolution. So we're going to go ahead and crank up the resolution to level 3, 4, and eventually level 5, which should take it up to, well, we'll see how many polys. I think it's somewhere around 4 million polys or so, just below 4 million. There it is, yeah, just below 4 million. And let's go ahead and turn off the wire real quick and also deselect this model. And so there's quite a bit of geometry here for this character, but you can see that how much detail is available on this surface. There's a lot of detail here and we can still move around at very high frame rates here. If you watch that, you can see that we're well over 100 in some cases, 140, 150 frames per second. So, we get a lot of detail out of these surfaces, and all those surfaces are prepared and detailed to that same level, to that same extent. Now, the idea is that you would go in and under Maps, extract Maps, New Operation, and extract the vector displacement information, which allows you to generate all the undercuts and very complex displacement for a model like this. So if I were to actually select something like this, we can pick this and say Add Selected. And so we have the node called Armor Low, that armor that surrounds him, selected as the target and the source, but you can see the source is level 5 and the target is level 0. And so if we produce this as a vector displacement map, we can if we wanted to, and it all depends on the amount of detail on that model. And if you want a solid representation of all that detail, go as high as possible. But of course, that's going to take a lot longer. But we can go for vector displacement maps, for normal maps, for AO maps, for traditional displacement maps. We can all take that up to 32K now. So the new ones are 16 and 32K. In here we can extract as a PTEX texture or as a regular texture. The PTEX textures are supported in Viewport 2.0 in Maya. And we can generate a base file name, so we can stick this anywhere we like and call this test, for example. And in this case, what I'll do is generate an OpenEXR 32-bit float. That's what's supported in Viewport 2.0 as well. And so let's go ahead and save that. Okay, that's just a warning if you want to bring something back in as a stamp or a stencil, to also have the addition of _VDM added to the name. And then you can hit the extract process. Now I'm not going to extract it because it's going to take quite a while for that to happen, but especially when you go to 16 or 32K. So let's go ahead and close it. I'm just going to open up the finished model in Maya with all of the vector displacement maps applied, EXR vector displacement maps applied, to get a sense of what you get on the Maya side. So here we are on the Maya side, and you can see that I have the model open already. And it's the low resolution version. You can see that we don't have that much in terms of resolution. And so let's go ahead and turn on shaded mode. You can see what that looks like. And if we wanted to, we can now bring in the textures. Now there are a couple things that you may already see as we get closer or look at the viewport, is that one, we're in Viewport 2.0, and two, we're in DirectX 11 mode. And I'll talk a little bit about that just to explain a little bit more about what's going on here. So here's our character. You can see that we have the geometry in the scene, and if I grab it and get a little closer, you can see that the geometry and the actual surface that's being rendered in the viewport are significantly offset from each other. And so that's kind of one of the things that is obvious about vector displacement, is that it will take the displacement off the surface, but also build undercuts and things that are very complex very efficiently. So let's go ahead and move out a bit and talk a little bit about the DirectX 11 component here. So a couple things. In 2013 SAP, we put in DirectX 11 as DirectX 11 shaders and the DirectX 11 shading engine to be supported through Viewport 2.0. So if I go to the plugin manager, the first thing that I would have to do here is turn on the DX11 shader.mll. So let's make sure that that is loaded. That will actually load the shader into the Hypershade window. The other thing that you want to make sure that is set up under Settings Preferences, and then under Settings Preferences, you want to make sure that under Display the DirectX 11 shading rendering engine is selected. And make sure that you save that, and when you do, restart Maya, and then it will take effect the next time, your next session in Maya. So in the Hypershade window, you can see that there are a bunch of DirectX shaders in here. I can create a DirectX shader now directly from, it's the third one from the top, by selecting it, double click it, and now you can start to add the shading information to this shader. So for example, if we jump into a view like, let's say a perspective 3, which is actually quite a nice one. Let's drop the background to a gradient and maybe turn on the lights in the scene as well. You can see that we get a lot of stuff going on here. There's ambient occlusion on the surface, which is a function of viewport 2.0. We have a depth of field on the camera that kind of blurs out things in the foreground, and around the head is kind of where the focal plane lies, and all the other things are kind of slowly blurring. Looking at the DirectX 11 shader, you can see that the default file that is loaded is the Maya ubershader.fxo. That's a compiled DirectX 11 shader that's loaded into the DirectX 11 shader preset. So if I create a shader like this, this shader file is automatically loaded. Down here we could control over lighting, we could control over ambient and emissive lighting. So if we want to add an ambient sky color or an ambient ground color, we can do that. You have to make sure that it's turned on, and so that that's when it will actually work. If you have diffuse maps that you want to work with, or so on. If I select a DirectX 11 shader that's already in the scene, let's say we'll grab the one for the armor. It's called armor. Let's go ahead and select it. You can see that we have a diffuse map here. I can offload that real quick, turn it back on. We can go back up here and turn on ambient emission for this shader. So anything that is assigned, that shader is assigned to, will be affected by those settings. We have a specular map in here. We can turn that on. We can turn that off. Normal information. We have a reflection map that's working on the surface, very subtle. And then of course we have the displacement. So there's a displacement switch and there's a tangent vector displacement switch, and we want both to work. And of course the file in this case is a .exr of the armor that was extracted in Mudbox and reapplied here in Maya. And then you have some displacement controls to kind of manipulate and modulate how the displacement looks on the surface. We also have translucence working in here. We can turn that on, turn that off. And if I rotate this model, actually let's jump into the turntable and get a little closer. You can see that as I rotate the model into the light, there's translucence on the head that's working, and that translucence is set up with some default colors. And of course you can modify that however you like. And so that's how this stuff can start to look in the software. Now in this case I have Camtasia running, which will drop the frames per second refresh rate a bit. But normally with Camtasia not running, I get anywhere between 15 and 20 frames per second on a laptop. And that's pretty decent for a large model like this with as many .exrs assigned to it. And that is kind of all I have for you guys. Thank you very much, and have a great day.